quarrel. See, they're wondering about how to get America into the war. And it continues in the book. The position will naturally be considerably eased if Japan were involved. And this might and probably would bring America in without further ado. At any rate, it would be a natural and obvious objective of our propagandists to achieve this, just as during the Great War they succeeded in embroiling the United States with Germany. That's 3 years before Pearl Harbor. The Japanese struck on December 7th of 1941. As soon as they did, we declared war on Japan, and Germany declared war on the United States. There was an alliance between Germany and Japan, and Italy involved in it as well. But the whole story of Tyler Kent is a story of conspiracy in high places, involving people in our country and involving them in Europe, especially Winston Churchill. Winston Churchill had a hand in getting us involved in World War I with the sinking of the Lusitania. He had a hand in getting us involved in World War II as well. When World War II began for us, it of course had existed for a couple of years in Europe. It began for us after Pearl Harbor, December 7, 1941. Practically everything that the United States had in military hardware, military equipment, was sent to Europe. Our forces in the Pacific were virtually starved. And the reason all of it went to Europe was to assist in defeating Germany before Germany could defeat the Soviet Union. Anything that could be done to keep the Soviet Union alive was done. And after the war ended, the Soviets were allowed to take Eastern Europe. The Pacific War eventually was won brilliantly. But the Pacific War should have ended in January of 1945 instead of in August of 1945, because in January of 1945, General Douglas MacArthur sent the Japanese offer to surrender to President Roosevelt, and the terms offered in January were identical with the terms that were eventually concluded in August of 1945. And that would have meant that there would have been no need for Iwo Jima. There would have been no need for Okinawa and the terrible loss of life on both sides. And of course, there would have been no need for an atomic bomb. But the atomic bomb was needed to hold over the heads of the American people and to scare us into the need for a world government. The real winner of World War II was the Soviet Union and the forces promoting world government. Also out of World War II came the need to create a world government organization. And where the Senate had said no to the League of Nations back in 1919, the Senate said yes in 1945 to the United Nations, and we were involved in the United Nations. It should come as no surprise that there were 43 members of the Council on Foreign Relations that we know of who were involved in planning the United States' entry into the United Nations. And there were 17 actual communists. Alger Hiss, who at the time was a communist, certainly would later become a member of the Council on Foreign Relations, was the Secretary General of the founding conference of the United Nations. Well, President Roosevelt died in April of 1945, and his vice president, Harry Truman, became the next president. As with Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the Truman administration had CFR members in important posts. This included Secretary of State Dean Acheson, State Department official Robert Lovett, Averell Harriman, John McCloy, George Kennan, Charles Boland, and the tenor of the Truman administration was to try to make sure that nobody investigated the government very deeply to find out all of the communists and subversives working within our government. In 1949, NATO was proposed. NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Dean Acheson gave a speech, prominent member of the Council on Foreign Relations, somebody who wanted world government, thought the United Nations was the answer to all of the problems of the people who wanted world government. And he said in that March 1949 speech, the United States government and governments with which we are associated in this treaty, NATO, are convinced that it is an essential measure for strengthening the United Nations. And that's what NATO should be looked upon as. It should be and should always have been looked upon as simply a regional arrangement under the United Nations for the purpose of bringing about a world government. Just as a sidelight, mention that right now today we have 20,000 troops in Bosnia under NATO. And the supply and the logistics and everything else involves tens of thousands of more American troops on ships and airfields and so forth outside of Bosnia that are also involved in that NATO operation. One of the chief crimes of the Truman administration was the betrayal of Chiang Kai-shek and the turning over of those hundreds of millions of people in China to the brutal murderers, in fact, the worst murderers that have ever existed. During the entire 20th century, practically, the United States government did everything it could to help communism in Russia. As I mentioned, had it not been for diplomatic intervention on the part of the United States government, Trotsky and Lenin would never have succeeded. Shortly after, in the 20s, communists were bailed out of significant difficulties with tremendous quantities of foodstuffs that were sent supposedly to help the people, but it was all given to the government, and the government used it to control the people. In the late 1920s, the government of the United States arranged for all kinds of technology and industrial equipment and so forth to go to Russia to help bring them into the 20th century. During the 30s, they were about to go under economically when we recognized them as a legitimate government, which we hadn't done up until that point, and supplied them with credit, and they were saved once again. During the 40s and the war, we built them into a world government, and in the 50s, 60s, 70s, we supplied them with tremendous aid, trade, and everything else. Despite all of the mirage about it, the United States government was never really an anti-communist government. Why build up the Soviets? Well, we'll skip ahead a little bit here, and then we'll come back, but skip ahead to 1962, and we see a man named Lincoln P. Bloomfield, a member of the Council on Foreign Relations, a professor at Massachusetts Institute of Technology, writing a State Department-funded report called A World Effectively Controlled by the United Nations. Now, you know what the report's all about from its title. How do we make a world effectively controlled by the United Nations? Well, there were many things in the book, in the report. It was originally classified, then declassified. We have a copy. And it talked about the need for the United Nations to become militarily supreme, disarm other nations, have a United Nations taxing authority, build a force of 500,000 armed men for the United Nations, even supply them with nuclear weapons to rule the world, compulsory jurisdiction of the United Nations World Court. All of this in this report by this Lincoln P. Bloomfield, 1962. But it also tipped us off as to why keep the Soviet Union menacing the West, where Bloomfield wrote, if the communist dynamic were greatly abated, the West might well lose whatever incentive it has for world government. Keep a big fright here called communism, aim it at the American people, and the American people more and more will be willing to say, well, we'd better have a world government. Happily, it didn't take, but it sure did have a lot of people feeling that way. We've jumped ahead too far. Let's go back to 1952. We go back to 1952 and the rise to political prominence of a man named Dwight David Eisenhower. General, World War II, top commander in Europe, head of NATO eventually. Publicly announced back in 1944 that he voted for Franklin Delano Roosevelt, was a very proud Democrat. In 1948, he let it be known he was perfectly willing to be nominated by the Democrat Party for president. And he was still willing to be the Democrat nominee as late as 1951. In 1949, he joined the Council on Foreign Relations. There was a group called Republican Advance, formed in 1950. Very liberal, very internationalist-minded group. It was formed by a host of Council on Foreign Relations members, including Clifford Case of New Jersey, Allen Dulles, John Foster Dulles, and Christian Herter. Those three were founders of the Council on Foreign Relations. Jacob Javits was part of it, senator from New York. Richard Nixon was part of it. They were all CFR